policymakers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has projected defiance at a once-in-a-decade military parade, showcasing the nation's growing firepower and diplomatic influence alongside its closest international allies. Now, in his speech, Xi called on troops to build a world-class military and defend China's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The Chinese nation is a great nation that is never intimidated by any bullies and always values independence and forges ahead. In the past, when faced with critical struggles between good and evil, light and darkness, progress and reaction, the Chinese people rallied together to defy the enemy.
Well, for more, Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Min Lo joins us. Min Min, so when you look at what we heard from Donald Trump, I mean, he was scathing, basically accusing Russia of China and China to conspire against the U.S. What do you make of those comments?
Yeah, it seems like President Trump has a little bit of a FOMO there, wanting to, chime in with a few of his comments. And he's saying that China is conspiring with Kim Jong-un as well as Putin against the U.S. He also asked whether President Xi was going to thank the U.S. for the massive amounts of blood shed during World War II in supporting China to gain its freedom and independence. And President Xi, in his speech, yes, he, of course, thanked veterans for their sacrifices, helping to, contribute to this victory over the Japanese during World War II. He made a nod to the contributions of foreign countries. He didn't name drop the U.S., but yes, I guess Trump has to be just content with that. But yes. Obviously, a lot of significance with Kim Jong-un and Putin around. Kim is his first trip to China since 2019 and his first foray into international diplomacy. And he toured a North Korean missile factory just ahead of this. And possibly he's coming here to China to maybe revive ties with China to try to seek more diplomatic and economic support, potentially ahead of renewed talks with President Trump, because we know Trump has indicated a willingness once again to meet with Kim to restart nuclear talks as well. But perhaps Kim Jong-un being present here along the lines of Putin and Xi is trying to elevate his standing and put himself on par with these leaders and put his country on par with these countries as a nuclear power, an irreversible trend that he's trying to project here, and maybe to gain acceptance from the likes of the U.S. that it is not going to roll back its nuclear program, especially as he unveiled new development plans for more ICBMs just ahead of this trip.
I mean, I guess the question, and you're explaining it, Kim Jong-un definitely shifted his image to global player from an isolated pariah, which he was seen as before. Is it three leaders that are trying to also regain or shift their sphere of influence?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the three of them standing together, just the optics of that, the cameras on them showing the two leaders flanking President Xi. It's an image of how they are united together, right, with this common vision of an alternative global order that is not dominated by the U.S. At the same time, it is an endorsement for President Xi because Chinese media has been all over this parade and talking about how there are 26 global leaders who are present. Modi is, of course, not there, perhaps distancing himself a little bit, given that India prides itself as a democracy. But it's an endorsement for President Xi. It's a projection of power because you see all these military hardware on display. One of our colleagues was quite interesting. He commented that you can see all these alphabets indicating the model of the military hardware, quite easily identifiable, which suggests that this is perhaps something that is outward-facing as much as it is inward-facing to inject this sense of patriotism among the people, right? There was a choir singing all these patriotic songs, talking about how there wouldn't be a China without the Chinese Communist Party. And if you watch Chinese state media, the commentator was talking about how, the suppression of Japan and how even in today's context, Japanese school children are not learning the right version of history. So there are clearly some anti-Japanese overtones. So no surprise that there have been reports from that the Japanese embassy has been calling on some diplomats from Europe and Asia not to attend the parade this morning.
Min Min, as always, thank you so much. Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Min Lona. In a moment, we'll discuss our other big story, the deepening global bond sell-off with Simon Kennedy, our senior executive editor for Macro Markets. But first, let's talk a little bit more about China and markets in general with Virginie Maisonneuve, Allianz Global Investors, Global Chief Investment Officer for Equities. You've just come back, Virginie. Good morning.
Good morning.
From a long trip, actually, from Asia. What do you see? What are the market dynamics that maybe geopolitics, are an extra layer?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with Min Min. The demonstration of the parade is both internal and external, both signals. In China, what I saw is really a lot of the animal spirit for the market is back. I mean, clearly the market is doing very well. If you look at defense stocks in particular, they've done well, but technology, etc. So there's definitely a relief versus where we were a few years ago. A lot of appetite to look at equities, partially influenced by government's messages that pension plans are an important thing to build and that, you shouldn't be all in bonds. You need to be in equities. And in particular, ETFs, there's definitely a message there. So, but I think beyond that, what we're seeing now is that full swing of the theme that we've discussed, shifting world order. This is absolutely what this is about. It's countries that are important, led in this case by China, saying to the U.S., maybe you've gone a little bit too far on the energy side to tell India and China, because energy is very important. And by the way, what can we can do? And I think that's definitely a step in history that we will remember.
Virginie, when you look at the geopolitics, though, is it that the Trump tariffs didn't go far enough in hurting China, or that they actually found some new ways of doing business?
I think it's actually the Trump tariffs are one thing, and we have to remember that it's not only a one-way street, because the U.S. need the rare earth. So we always talked about semiconductors versus rare earths, which are absolutely essential for the defense sector. So I think from that perspective, the tariffs are okay. I think it's just this assumption that the U.S. can impose under this presidency principles of who buys energy where, and frankly, from a country like China, the second largest economy in the world, that's going a bit too far in my view, right? That's what this is about. We also have future negotiations coming, and of course, that there's always, I was really interested with the part on Siberia 2, the pipeline for LNG, because part of the Trump agenda is buy my energy. That's I will be the leader in the world. And actually, if Siberia 2 goes forward, Russian gas would double as a percentage of gas for China. That's a very important piece because it's a long-term trend. You don't switch off those pipelines. It's not a done deal yet, but that piece, I think we have to watch very closely.
So interesting. I mean, our other big stories, of course, some of these global bonds, most of the global bonds are facing a renewed selling pressure due to jitters around inflation, debt sales, but also fiscal discipline. So I could not be more delighted than to welcome Simon Kennedy, our senior executive editor for Macro Markets. Simon, I mean, the thing is that, there's a lot more renewed pressures and markets are just nervous. Inflation, fiscal discipline, debt sales. Is there anything to stop this global bond sell-off?
Yeah, there's quite a bit, and we should be clear, this isn't necessarily a rout, this is kind of a grind higher around the world. There's definitely a back-to-school feeling. September hits, and there's more bond sales coming out. The central banks come into focus a little bit more. We've still got those issues with the kind of the discussion around central bank independence in the US. So everyone comes back to school, markets reopen or have been open, but perhaps tune into those big debates. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons to think this is a kind of a steady grind rather than the kind of dramatic sell-off we saw in April that we saw 3 years ago in the UK. But certainly it's a cause of concern for governments around the world, and pressingly in the UK, which seems to be the one kind of in a situation where it's trying to get ahead of it. It's talking the right language, but yet this budget isn't going to be for a few weeks off, and so the government is kind of under increasing pressure. And of course, as the yields go up, that kind of doom loop risk grows, that it could feed back into the deficit. The debts go even higher, and the government's chasing after it. But certainly a feeling in the UK of concern this week.
Is there any concern that actually something disorderly happens? Because for the moment, you're right. I mean, there's nothing disorderly. It's just that, they keep on climbing. What happens next is impossible to say, but is there anything that you're watching? It's especially the long-term bonds that we need to watch out for right now.
So we may well have hit it, but we're within a whisker of 5% on the 30-year in the US. That was already hit in July. In kind of defence of maybe the question is why is it not disorderly? Right. If you look at the US especially, a lot of things have been thrown at bond traders in the last few weeks. These kind of things that you'd never have questioned in previous cycles. The independence of the Federal Reserve is now front and centre. We've shifted, as the Bloomberg Big Take talked about a couple of days ago, we've shifted from kind of the president lobbying or pressuring via social media to actively intervening, to actively trying to get rid of one member of the FOMC. And yet the bond market has been, there's certain metrics, inflation expectations, a couple of others where you're starting to see some concerns, but there's not that outright a sell-off, and there's reasons for that. And yet at the back of the minds, there's these debt loads which very few governments are really trying to get on top of. And in fact, in the US, they're talking about tax cuts, not reining it in. So you've got these debt loads, and as we've previously seen, is this time different? I'm not quite so sure, but for the moment, it could be a lot worse than it actually is, I would say.
Virginie, I mean, what I'm taken by is that there's quite an unusual situation that basically investors want for more compensation to long-term bonds, which is why we're seeing rising U.S. 30-year yields but falling 2-year ones.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that contradiction. On one hand, you could see how 2026 could be an okay year in terms of macro in the U.S. You have the new rules on expensive CapEx and the AI trends. And, this is really positive. You also have a job market that's actually quite balanced, even though the numbers may come out worse, right? Or the revisions may be negative. It's actually not bad. But at the same time, you have this huge financing need on the long term. And we know the long term is very important to the U.S. And potentially what I think might be perceived as a potential policy mistake if you had too much cuts in the short term. And we have to remember, if we're in a stagflation, fear environment, in the 70s, you've had 3 times where cutting rates too aggressively were labeled as policy mistakes. And I think that's possible. That's what the market is, in addition to governance, etc., is trying to think about, well, wait a minute, if actually we can look through, are we at risk of aggressive cuts that might not be needed in the end, right? And that steepening of the curve, of course, it will damage the financing needs, etc., that companies need to have. So it's a fine balance. We might be, in the middle range where we don't have a route, but definitely some tensions and people coming back and a lot of issues this week, etc.
I mean, I feel like it's going to be a long 6 months. Right, in terms of data points, just in terms of what the Fed does and extra political pressure.
We've got payrolls on Friday in the US that could reinforce or totally turn it around.
Simon, thank you. Virginie, when you look at equities, right, your wheelhouse, and again, there's always this interplay between bonds and equities. Where do you see equities going?
Well, I think that you should have a period of consolidation that you should use to buy if you're not positioned as you should be, because I believe 26 globally and in the US will be okay. I think you have this underlying long-term trend of CapEx and technology and AI that, I'm still very much in favor of. Of course, you can't look at tech in general. You have
valuations, Virginie, are also to the sky.
Well, 29 times on the S&P tech versus 20, so you are over, but you're not in bubble territory yet. And, it depends on how people are positioned. But if you look at software, for example, it's not done that well. Some companies in software are going to win the game. If you look at cybersecurity, think of AI and quantum computing together. There is no price pressure on cybersecurity. There's some areas where you still have room to grow. And I think any fall in the market you should use for 26 positioning.
What do you buy in Europe?
Well, Europe is really interesting because you had the low valuation, still low valuation, political volatility, as we know, France, although I think this time may not be the big one, right? This impulse around German fiscal rules and spending and capex and this sort of maturity suddenly in Europe. So that I still like, but you have to really be stock picking.
Stock picking, I mean, again, depending on, I mean, do you choose the leaders in a certain industry, or do you just look at, defense is one that comes to mind?
Yes.
I guess some of them are overbought.
Yes. So tech is defense, defense is tech. Some have gone up already a lot. I think if you had market consolidations, and you have to think broadly on what this means. It's not only about defense, it's about resilience of Europe, it's about infrastructure. There's a lot of subsectors that can actually do well. Energy is one piece that I think is very interesting, particularly in light of AI capex, which is very energy intensive.
Virginie, thank you so much. As always, Virginie Maisonneuve there, Allianz, a global investors, global chief investment officer for Equities. Now, coming up, Lisa Cook's lawyers accuse President Trump of using copy and paste allegations to try and oust her from the Fed. The latest on that legal battle is next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, lawyers for Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook have described President Trump's move to oust her as being based on nothing more than cut and paste allegations of mortgage fraud made in social media posts. Now, in the latest court filings, Cook's attorney said Trump lacked valid grounds to fire her for cause. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Ross Matheson. Ross, good morning. So where next for the legal case?
Well, as you were saying, there were the latest filings on Tuesday from Lisa Cook's lawyers making those counterclaims. It didn't stop, of course, the administration from making further allegations against her yesterday on social media, and they're likely to file their latest themselves on Thursday. So we're not really going to get any kind of ruling on this week, and that means at least next week, maybe at the earliest. But what Lisa Cook is seeking, of course, is the ability to stay in her job while this is all playing out and not having to recuse herself. And that's going to become very important because we are coming up against a Fed Reserve meeting in mid-September. That's getting ever closer, and all eyes on whether the Fed does indeed cut rates there. So, we are getting to the point where everyone's wondering, is she going to be part of that decision or not? But we're unlikely to get an initial ruling from the court on that front, at least now until next week.
But among the many issues that his administration is dealing with, meanwhile, President Trump says he will ask the Supreme Court for an expedited ruling on tariffs, Roz.
Well, that's right. So there's a lot still going on with this administration. I mean, just on the Fed again, you've got the US, you've got Scott Bessent saying that he wants to start interviewing candidates for the new Fed chair as soon as this week, with a large slate to get through. So that's also on the agenda. You've also got Donald Trump saying he wants to go straight to the Supreme Court to try and get a fresh ruling on his tariffs after, of course, his regime was somewhat overturned by a lower court. So he's not going to go back to a lower court. He's going to go straight to the Supreme Court, it seems, and try and get some relief there. And of course, the Supreme Court has largely sided with Donald Trump and his administration so far, not entirely, but largely. So obviously he's trying to push something through quickly here and get a little bit of that uncertainty lifted over the future of all the trade measures that he's taken so far, because he's still got a lot to do. He's got trade frameworks without a lot of meat on the bones with the EU, for example. He's got trade deals kind of in the air, still hanging in a lot of terms with countries like Japan. So obviously he wants to clear the uncertainty here and crack on with some of those trade deals. And of course, the big question, the trade truce with China, that's coming up also. So an awful lot on his slate in the next couple of weeks.
Roz, as always, thank you so much. Roz Matheson there with the very latest, of course, on what the Trump administration is doing. Now, Google will not have to sell its Chrome business after a ruling by a judge in the biggest U.S. antitrust case in almost 3 decades. The tech giant will, however, be required to share online search data with rivals. The ruling represents a blow to the U.S. government, falling far short of the most severe penalties sought by regulators after the court previously found Google illegally monopolized the search market. Well, for more, I'm joined by Tamlin Basin, who covers tech policy and litigation for Bloomberg Intelligence. Tamlin, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, practically, what changes for Google will happen as a result of the ruling?
Well, I think you hit it. This falls far short of what the government wanted, and practically what changes for Google is very little. As you mentioned, they do or have to share some of that search data with their rivals. They're going to have to do that going forward on a pretty routine basis. Also, these exclusive arrangements they had with OEMs, they can no longer engage in those exclusive arrangements. However, they can still pay firms like Apple to be the default search bar on an Apple iPhone. So in some senses, not a lot is changed for Google. It can be seen as a pretty big victory for Google in this.
Tamlin, what were the biggest surprises of the decision then?
So I think the biggest surprise of the decision, I don't think necessarily was the lack of a divestiture of Chrome. I think coming out of the remedial trial, we thought that might have been a step too far that the government was asking. However, I think those exclusive payments, we did think those were going to be vulnerable. Reading Judge Mehta's decision, though, the reason he refused to bar those is he thought ultimately it would benefit Google if it was no longer going to be paying Apple that $20 billion a year. Judge Mehta thought that Google would just use that to further improve its search, whereas Apple and some of the other OEMs would actually be harmed by not getting those revenues.
But so how big of a blow is this to the U.S. government's efforts to crack down on big tech?
So I think this was a case that was seen as a pretty good indicator of how successful these challenges to big tech were going to be. We do have other cases against Google on ad tech. We have cases against Meta coming up really relating to its past acquisitions and against Apple. But I think especially coming out of the trial where Judge Mehta did find that search was an illegal monopoly, we thought we might have had some remedies with more teeth. So I think this does maybe make the DOJ take a reset and really think about what strategies it's going to sort of leverage going forward to get more successful results in these cases.
So tell me, is it early days to try and understand whether the ruling suggests that some of the pressure on regulation will likely ease off?
I think it is early days. However, the way we read it is there are some indicators, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe, that maybe there might be some easing regulatory pressure. I think just yesterday there were reports that the European Commission, which has been looking at Google's ad tech stack, that it's decided to delay a final decision on that for fears of sort of alienating the Trump administration as these trade talks are progressing. So I think what we can see is I think regulators are going to be very methodical going forward about how to sort of best bring these rules against big tech.
Tamlin, thank you so much for joining us. Tamlin Basin there from Bloomberg Intelligence. Now, AI unicorn Anthropic has closed a $13 billion funding round, nearly tripling its valuation to $183 billion. Anthropic says it will use the funds to meet enterprise demand, expand globally, and advance AI safety research. Apple's leading AI researcher for robotics has left to join Meta in the latest departure from the iPhone maker. Well, sources say 3 more members of Apple's large language models teams are also leaving, 2 to OpenAI and 1 to Anthropic. The exits follow the loss of the group's chief and raise fresh questions about Apple's AI strategy. Now, Bloomberg has also learned that Jane Street has made second quarter net trading revenue of $10.1 billion, beating all of the biggest banks to set a Wall Street record. Sources say the sales figure is more than double that from a year earlier and pushes Jane Street's first half totals to a record as well. Well, trading volumes have been elevated as investors rushed to reposition portfolios around President Trump's tariffs. Coming up, the French Prime Minister, Francois Bayrou, offers a budget compromise in an effort to prevent his government collapsing. The latest from Paris is next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Donald Trump accuses Xi Jinping of conspiring against the U.S. with Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, the Chinese, Russian, and North Korean leaders coming together to witness a show of Chinese military strength. Bond sell-off, long-end Treasury and JGB yields continue to climb, and UK gilts weaken further as deficit concerns mount. Plus, Google jumps pre-market as it avoids being forced to sell off its web browser Chrome in the biggest U.S. antitrust case in almost 3 decades. Now, the French Prime Minister, François Bayrou, says he might re-examine the idea of scrapping 2 bank holidays if that's a way to find a compromise ahead of Monday's confidence vote. Well, Bayrou spoke this morning in an interview on a French channel, BFM TV.
Scrapping 2 public holidays represent 10% of the effort that needs to be made.
That's $4 billion.
As I said last night, I met with political parties such as the Republicans who told me we may have solutions that allow us to find this effort in ways other than scrapping the 2 public holidays. Very well then, I'm ready to examine all solutions.
Well, our own Caroline Conant is in Paris. Caroline, the political situation seems increasingly unstable. Will he be voted down next Monday?
It's very likely, Francine. He didn't say much new in this BFM interview, only repeating that it could possibly abandon this idea of scrapping 2 bank holidays if there are other options on the table to find the 44 billion euros needed in this next budget. Of course, he also said that he is trying to reach out to the socialists. He's going to talk to them tomorrow, having had already numerous meetings with various parties. The problem, Francine, is that he doesn't only need the socialists to abstain, he actually needs the socialists to vote in favor, because this is not a vote of no confidence, this is a vote of confidence. So this is actually a step further. Francois Bayrou repeated this morning that new snap elections would actually just create more chaos and would cost a lot to the French state coffers. In fact, our own Bloomberg Economics have estimated that the last government collapse of Michel Barnier back in December already cost 6 billion euros to the French state coffers. So it's actually more than what these 2 bank holidays scrapping would actually bring in. So at this stage, the chances of a government collapse on Monday are around 98%, according to Polymarket. Francois Bayrou held talks also with Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella from the National Rally yesterday, who said that a miracle hasn't happened. In between all these meetings, Francois Bayrou also had lunch with President Macron yesterday, who said perhaps an agreement with the socialists is still possible, perhaps testing the waters on what Macron is going to do after September 8th.
Caroline, thank you so much. Caroline Conant there in Paris. Now with us this morning, Simon Macadam, Deputy Chief Global Economist at Capital Economics. Simon, so good to speak to you. I have 1,001 questions about deficits and everything that's happening in France. But there does seem to be a move generally of investors just being a lot more worried about bonds because of deficits, because of inflation, because of everything in between. And France right now is just a worrying political situation. What does it mean economically for the country?
Well, for France in particular, there's clearly upward pressure on bond yields across advanced economies, so it isn't just a France-specific issue. I think there are concerns fiscally that are emerging in many places. For France in particular, it seems like a slow car crash, doesn't it? It's sort of quite a sad state of affairs that there seems to be a political impasse that is going to prevent the necessary fiscal consolidation that's going to calm markets and get France back onto a sustainable growth path. So in the near term, there's going to be continued uncertainty about the fiscal outlook. I think continued upward pressure on bond yields in France relative to other European bond markets, and that itself might in turn start to affect economic activity. At the moment, I think we're quite far away from that, but if things really get out of control over the next couple of years, it's quite foreseeable that we see a tightening of financial conditions in other parts of the Eurozone as well. I mean,
it's a strange, when you look at the market dynamics, it is quite strange to see investors ask for premium for longer dated bonds instead of the shorter ones. So when does this really become a problem, for example, for Europe?
When it comes to problem in Europe, I mean, in the near term, if there is to be significant upward pressure on French yields, we're in a position where the ECB has the toolkit to manage that, right? So the transmission protection instrument was designed for this sort of purpose. This is about a country-specific issue, and it wants to guard against the progress being seen in places like Italy, where we have got the political stability, we have seen measures towards fiscal consolidation, and the fiscal outlook that looks better. So I think the ECB will guard other parts of the Eurozone against any pressure that emerges in France. I think where we have to sort of cross the Rubicon is when the fiscal problem in France gets so large that it calls into question the European project. It's that sort of magnitude of problem, which we're very far away from at the moment. It's that sort of magnitude of a problem that would have to get you to a place where the ECB would struggle to contain the contagion risks from a French-induced crisis.
What about the U.S.? We had our senior executive editor for markets, and he was saying, look, given everything that bond markets are being thrown at, including central bank independence questioning, it's actually quite incredible that we're not seeing a disorderly move in any way.
Well, I mean, these claims about Federal Reserve independence being undermined, clearly there's something to it in the sense that Trump is obviously publicly admonishing members of the Federal Reserve Board, and this firing of Lisa Cook adds to a sense in which he's trying to exert greater control and have greater influence over a growing share of the FOMC voting members, he still will be short of a majority of the FOMC members next year. I don't want to underplay the extent to which this is a big deal, but the idea that this is going to increase long-term yields across, increase bond yields across the curve for the United States, I don't think that that's a huge risk at the moment, because I think that at the same time as these concerns about Fed independence, you've also got potentially more interest rate cuts coming in the coming year, and even more so if Trump gets his way and more of the FOMC fall to his way of looking at things. So it's a mixed picture, I think, in terms of the interest rate outlook for the yield curve.
Is there a danger that actually the Fed cuts too much this year, and so we'll have problems into 2026? And what are you expecting from the jobs data this week?
I don't think there's a risk of the Fed cutting too much this year. I think that the September cut is almost pretty much nailed on. I think there's quite a high bar not to cut in September, and there'll probably be another cut as well in Q4. But the idea that they can cut too much just in the closing months of this year that would seriously jeopardise the economic outlook, I don't think that's the case. What we're seeing is that tariff effects being very, very small. We're struggling to get a magnifying glass out to see the effect of tariffs on inflation. And at the same time, obviously, there are deteriorating conditions in the jobs market.
Right.
So I think that the stars are aligning for Fed rate cuts, and I don't think we're in a position where they're going to be cutting too much that would stoke inflation further down the line.
So talk to me about the UK. So first of all, look, we have a budget day. We've been waiting for it for quite some time, and the Chancellor just announcing it on Twitter via HM Treasury Twitter handle, and that will be on November 26th. So it is quite late compared to other autumn statements. It's a difficult week also because it seems that maybe Treasury is losing a little bit more power and control of the economy. What are you expecting for there to be in that autumn statement? It's a very, very narrow window of where she can land the plane.
Yeah. Basically, the bond market is saying don't borrow, and Labour backbenchers in the Parliament are saying don't cut expenditure. So what does that leave you? It leaves
nightmare.
It leaves you a nightmare, but I think if you've got to find a way out of this nightmare, it's towards higher taxes. Now, of course, the Labour government has been straddled by its commitment it made at the general election to not raise taxes directly on households. It's going to have to come up with some imaginative ways to try and get around that, because it does have to broaden the tax base if it's going to make it through, and to reassure investors that fiscal policy is indeed on a sustainable path, which is ultimately what the Starmer-Reeves duet is all about. That is the big message on fiscal policy, that you can trust us with the nation's finances.
Yeah, but do you worry about the UK more than other countries just because of the self-imposed fiscal rules that they put in place?
I wouldn't say, we don't worry about it more than France and the United States, but the US, the UK, France and Italy, we can call them the fiscal four. They are the four major economies that have serious fiscal issues, and they are the places to watch for in terms of emerging pressure in bond markets. But I wouldn't say that the UK lands itself in the same group as the US and France, where the risks, both in terms of the magnitude of the fiscal problems, are larger, but also in the case of the US, if they don't get that tariff revenue coming through to fund the big, beautiful bill, you're going to be in a position where that's potential loosening of fiscal policy at a time when the budget deficits are already huge. And I think that you're then entering the realms where there could be crowding out of private sector activity. It puts upward pressure on interest rates, but also hurts the economy.
I mean, so far, it feels like investors are surprised, actually, that the tariffs are, seemingly could cover what they're going to spend for the big, beautiful bill. Is that fair, or is it just too early to say?
If the tariff revenue comes in as the Congressional Budget Office expects, then it all adds up quite nicely over the next 10 years. There's been a lovely bit of arithmetic there. A bit of a net loosening in the near term, net tightening in the longer term. You could argue governments always like arranging fiscal policy like that. We have the bad news further away that we'll never have to come to it. But all in all, you are in a state where the CBO suggests that the tariff revenue will all net out, so you don't have to worry too much about the deficit getting even wider. But of course, this legal ruling starts to shed some doubt over whether that tariff revenue can be counted on to raise the sort of revenues they're expecting over the next few years.
There you go. Simon and I liking good maths. That's the bottom line. Simon, thank you so much for joining us. Simon Macadam, Deputy Chief Global Economist at Capital Economics. Now, BlackRock has lost a mandate worth 14.7 billion euros with one of the largest pension funds in the Netherlands. It comes amid concerns that the world's biggest money manager is not acting in the best interests of clients when it it comes to climate risks. Now, Dutch pension fund PFZW is the latest asset owner to voice discontent with U.S. managers that have retreated from climate alliances after an all-out assault on the net zero policies by the White House. A BlackRock representative did not immediately respond to a request for comment. And the U.S. pushing back against any creative accounting by European allies to reach a new NATO spending target. Now, disapproval is putting Italy on the spot as the government weighs whether to count the construction of a $15.7 billion bridge that links the island of Sicily with the mainland as military expenditure. While the U.S. ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, said he was watching the project in Italy, quote, very carefully. And ties between President Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin have frayed since their meeting in Alaska as Russia continues to attack Ukraine. Putin was amongst the leaders hosted by the Chinese president at a major military parade in Beijing, a gathering that has raised the ire of Trump, who accused China of conspiring against the United States. Now, Putin has praised the military parade. He also noted special relations with North Korea after a meeting with Kim Jong-un. Let's discuss Putin's China trip with Stephanie Baker, our senior writer. Stephanie, as always, thank you for joining us. So Putin's presence in China has definitely not gone well in Washington.
No, it hasn't. Trump first dismissed this as not significant, saying he had great relations with China's Xi Jinping and that China needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs China. And then he came out with this tweet saying, actually, they're conspiring against us. You know, I think it's a sign that Trump's art of the deal and coercion tactics, using tariffs all around the world, is not only not working as intended, but is backfiring. It's only driven India's Modi into the orbit of Putin and Xi by imposing these additional 50% tariffs on India for its import of Russian oil. I think we'll see if he comes out with a tougher response on Russia that he's threatening to do. His deadline of 2 weeks has already come and gone, and still nothing. But I don't expect him to come out with any tougher response, like more sanctions. And so,
this, as you say, seems mainly towards energy, because we also saw a deal between Russia and China on gas.
Yeah, this is something that Russia has been trying to get going for years, this Power of Siberia 2 pipeline to transmit gas to China. Now that Russia has lost its European market due to the war in Ukraine and Europe's shunning of Russian gas, it's been trying to get this new pipeline off the ground. I would note that there's not a lot of details on that. It looks like an announcement. There's no timeline. China hasn't actually confirmed it. So, and even if it does go ahead, it's going to take at least 4 or 5 years to get off the ground.
So where does this all leave the war in Ukraine? I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we there was talk about it, some kind of compromise, and now the U.S. and Russia are not on friendly terms anymore.
Yeah, I think Ukraine is in even a worse position now than it was a few weeks ago. Putin has been rehabilitated on the global stage, first with Alaska, now with this all these meetings in China. And I don't see there's not really any kind of concerted effort from the West to respond and force Putin to the negotiating table. He's now surrounded himself with these strongman leaders who have provided an economic lifeline to Russia in spite of sanctions. So unless Europe can really get its act together and really push forward with additional arms sales to Ukraine, and unless the U.S. responds with additional sanctions, I don't see how this is going to end. Putin has not given up his goals of controlling Ukraine, and he's been demanding that they resolve the root causes of the crisis, which is basically his demand that Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of influence.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie Baker, there, our senior writer and, of course, author of a terrific book called Punishing Putin. Now, coming up, we'll speak to Norway's defense minister about a £10 billion warship deal with the UK. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, NATO's northern flank is set to be strengthened following a deal between Norway and the UK. Norway has picked the UK as a supplier of frigates for its navy in what would be the biggest ever investment in the Nordic country's defence. Well, we're now joined by Tore Sandvik, the Norwegian Minister of Defence. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. Now, according to media reports, France was also a very serious competitor to the UK. So what made you pick the UK with a longer delivery time over France?
It was a very difficult choice, and we had 4 very good contenders, both Germany, France, UK and the Americans, close allies to Norway, all 4. But it was a decision with a lot of factors. So we decided to go with the Brits because in the end it was a lot of factors who decided it.
So are you worried at all about Norway's navy needing the capabilities before 2030, which is when deliveries are due to start?
No, we already have frigates, but we want to exchange them with the new frigates. So this is completely in line with our plans in the long-term defense plan. Starting from 2029 with education and with phasing in the new frigates and deliveries in 2030. So it's in line with our plans.
Minister, have you heard any reactions yet from the US over Norway's decision?
No, and we will still be a very close ally to the US. In the north, we are looking after the nuclear weapons. The world's biggest nuclear arsenal is at the Kola Peninsula, just a few miles from the Norwegian border. And we're looking after them for the whole alliance. And they're pointing not to Norway, but to the big American cities, to London, to our allies. And we're also looking after the strategic submarines and the multi-role submarines, which are threatening the undersea infrastructure and also with the nuclear capacities. So we're looking after that, and we're using both F-35s, P-8s, and working every day closely with the Americans, with the Brits, and with our allies. So we will still do that in the future.
You said you haven't had any reactions so far from the US. Are you expecting any reactions going forward from them?
No, we don't think so, because we are still working very closely with them. They are looking after us because we are looking after the nuclear weapons for them and for the alliance. And that's also when we're buying new submarines. It's for hunting submarines. The new frigates is for hunting submarines. That's the main capacity of the new frigates, to deter Russia from going into the Northern Sea and the Atlantics with their submarines and the Northern Fleet, which is still intact. Even though he's fighting in Ukraine, they are still intact.
Minister, we have seen a political uproar in Norway over the sovereign wealth fund's investment in Israel. There are media reports suggesting that BAE Systems have used Israeli subcontractors. Are you concerned about that? Could there be a similar criticism to the government because of this choice?
There will be some criticism, but overall, it's a great support for the companyship with the Brits. And the main reasons we now are doing this in a new way is that we want completely like the Brits the same frigates. Because we are going to have these frigates in 20-30 years' time, and we want to do it together with the Brits. We will have the same ships. We will share the same weapon systems, so we can keep this operative over the period with less use of money. So we will not do anything to do this. Frigates different from each other.
Okay. Minister, Norway, of course, is amongst the NATO members that border Russia. How worried are you about the security situation right now and your expectations of what could happen in Ukraine?
Well, Putin is engaged in Ukraine, so we not see anymore a lot of the land forces in the north. But the Northern Fleet is still intact. And the Northern Fleet and the strategic submarines and the multi-role submarines are still a threat to the alliance together with the nuclear arsenal. So that's what we are preparing for. But the biggest threat is Putin succeeding in Ukraine and deepening his cooperation with China and North Korea and Iran. That is the deepest threat. Therefore, we still will support Ukraine. We have to give Ukraine the upper hand in negotiations for a peace deal. That's the most important thing. Putin, if he succeeds in Ukraine, then it will get dangerous.
I mean, the bombing from Russia of Ukraine doesn't seem to have stopped. And at the same time, by Vladimir Putin actually showing up on Russia, on U.S. soil, seems to have been normalized amongst allies and enemies again. Does that make the Ukraine situation a lot more precarious?
I think it's most important now that Europe is stepping up, taking more responsibility both for own security and for Ukraine. And that's what we're doing. Over the summer, we've been searching for air defense systems for Ukraine. And together with Germany, Norway now has been financing 2 Patriot systems. And we can now see that more of the European countries are stepping up and buying from US stocks. Weapons for defense of Ukraine. And we're also investing heavily in the Ukraine defense industry to both to give them offensive capacities, but also to defend themselves. So I think that's the most important thing to do in the time to come now, to give Ukraine the upper hand by defending them, and also to strengthen the sanctions against Russia, because the Russian economy is weak and they are in really big troubles.
Thank you so much, Norway's Minister of Defense, Sturre Sandvik, with the most beautiful background that we've seen today so far. Now, BlackRock has lost a mandate worth 14.5 billion euros with one of the largest pension funds in the Netherlands. It comes amid concerns that the world's biggest money manager is not acting in the best interests of clients when it comes to climate risk. Now, a BlackRock representative did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Tom Metcalf, who oversees all of our financial offerings. So, Tom, good morning. What more do we know?
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic that's developing, principally between Europe and, big American money managers. So this big Dutch pension fund has effectively dropped BlackRock, one of its biggest managers of its equity portfolio. And the sense is, look, this is coming as they sort of rearrange how they look at equities as a whole, but it's definitely also driven by this sort of, dissatisfaction at how BlackRock is responding to the sort of the new administration, and the sense that, they previously talked a big game, but they aren't seeing sort of that kind of focus on climate control. So they're taking a different tack and moving away from BlackRock.
But, Tom, I guess there are plenty of, European money managers that are maybe not as focused on climate change. So is the worry that actually BlackRock is American and so, possibly close to the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think the fact it's America makes it an obvious target, and it's certainly the one that various protesters, which hold a lot of sway in countries like Netherlands, have been looking at. So I think, rightly or wrongly, it's definitely sort of top of people's mind, top of focus. And also in terms of, as you make those changes, you do look at your biggest money managers, right? And BlackRock's probably got the biggest mandates at lots of these pension funds. So it's not the first time we've seen this. I'm sure there'll be sort of more movement. But of course, kind of as you move from country to country, the dynamics are very different, and a lot of people probably go, wait a minute, BlackRock, massive global manager, do we really want to exclude them?
Tom, thank you so much. Tom Metcalf there, who leads all of our financial coverage in Europe and the Middle East. Up next, a Bloomberg Brief. Of course, the focus is on what we're seeing with gilts and U.S. Treasuries. The focus is also on the UK budget. Finally, we have a date. Rachel Reeves on Twitter announcing it is November 26. This is Bloomberg.